Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
And we're definitely glad you are with us on this Veterans Day edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Thank you, a very heartfelt thank you to all of you who have served this nation in uniform and those who have done so over the many years of this great republic. Rob Long is here instead of Jim today. Jim is still on vacation. So, Rob, it's great to have you back.
I'm happy to be back. Garrity's endless vacations. I mean, sign me up.
It's like when the media used to get mad at George W. Bush for spending a month at the ranch down there, right? And they didn't like hanging out in Crawford. They much prefer Martha's Vineyard in August for some reason.
And they hated it when Reagan would go to the Reagan Ranch in Santa Barbara until they realized that meant they all could stay at the Four Seasons Biltmore. No. They all stayed about 45 minutes down the hill. They loved it.
It's all about perspective. There we go. Excellent. So we have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. And so let's start with the good news. And Rob, anytime there's bad news for socialists and authoritarians, it's good news for conservatives. So let's start here with what's happening in Bolivia. First of all, with the Washington Post. Decrying what he called a coup, Evo Morales resigned as president of Bolivia amid an increasingly violent uprising that reached a tipping point Sunday when the military pulled its support. Morales' stunning fall after nearly 14 years in office came hours after the Organization of American States said it had found clear manipulation of the vote last month in which the elder statesmen of the Latin American left claimed victory. The dizzying pace of development Sunday made an ignominious ending for the region's longest-serving leader. Bolivia's first indigenous president won credit for fighting poverty and transforming cities with state investment, even as criticism of his authoritarian tendencies rose. Don't you love how that's an afterthought to the Post?
Yeah.
Ultimately,
They're sad about it.
I know. Ultimately, the 60-year-old socialist who once commanded landslide victories at the polls found himself isolated. And then you have the New York Times pointing out, he was actually term limited, wasn't supposed to be eligible for a fourth term, but ran anyway, and then manipulated the voting to cling to power. You'll be shocked, Rob, to find out that Ilhan Omar's not happy about this. She says there's a word for the president of a country being pushed out by the military. It's called a coup. We must unequivocally oppose political violence in Bolivia. Bolivians deserve free and fair elections. And Dr. Jill Stein, also not happy about this. Right-wing opposition launched violent protests following his recent re-election, she says. So all the right people are really sad, Rob, here. So this is great.
It seems insane to me that they don't take the easy layup. You know, it's like you get to condemn him, you get to say everything you want, you get to say, oh, well, he was an authoritarian, he's no friend of mine. But instead, they have this weird tribal loyalty. It reminds me a little bit of like arch conservatives in the '60s who would make these elaborate excuses for right-wing dictators all over the place. Not out of real politic, not out of, the guy's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, but out of some kind of like, well, when you really look at the picture of, Salazar or Franco or even Pinochet, someone is handing Ilhan Omar and Dr. Jill Stein. By the way, I haven't heard the name Dr. Jill Stein in a while, so thank you for that. They've handed them a beautiful, beautiful bonbon. All they have to do is take a bite out of it and say, yeah, well, you got to obey the rule of law. Instead, they retreated to form. The strange thing about Bolivia, actually, is that I don't think that Bolivia is not a basket case compared to its neighbors and the basket cases in the region. It's only got it's going to have. Listen to me. It's only going to have 3% inflation next year, but that is pretty good compared to its regional colleagues. Even on a humanitarian level, this is to be applauded, right? I mean, the amount of blood in the streets, the amount of starvation, the amount of collapse, the amount of chaos. At a minimum, and that's a good thing for the region. We should all applaud it.
Because, of course, as soon as you think of socialists in Latin America, you think of the absolute collapse of Venezuela right now. Right. And, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even while the time Chavez was still alive, and they were doing pretty well economically because of all the oil they had, and the oil market had huge prices per barrel, and you had folks like Bernie Sanders and other folks on the far left saying, that's a pretty good model down there. And now that it's just gone completely into the trash can, they're like, oh, no, that's not socialism. This is just a thug and a kleptocracy. I'm about Scandinavian and Canadian socialism. I never had anything to do with the folks down there. So,
well, I am too. I'm for. I think it's Sweden. I'm for Swedish socialism too. Privatized Social Security, a private healthcare system, property taxes, school choice. I'm for all of those things. More Swedish socialism, says I. When you really get down to it, when you drill down to the actual socialism in Scandinavia, it's they're more free market than California. That's good. What's happened is that Venezuela refuses to disappear. And what people in the media and the left here in America want is they want it to disappear. That's what happens when it all collapses. It goes down a memory hole. I'm old enough to remember when the country of Nicaragua was on the front page of the New York Times every single day, sometimes twice a day if they could print an extra paper. It led the news every day. It was all about the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua and how popular it was until they had a free election. And the Sandinistas were turfed out in a free election, and Nicaragua disappeared. You couldn't find it on page A29 in the New York Times. It was no longer interesting. And unfortunately, Venezuela remains interesting because it's so incredibly chaotic and violent down there. So it's impossible to ignore it. But boy, would they love to ignore it. And they're going to do their best to ignore Bolivia, too.
Oh, absolutely, because that hadn't really been as much on the news map as Venezuela, certainly. So it's probably a little bit easier for them to ignore, even though there's a dictator forced out of power there. But
that's supposed to be good, by the way.
Yes,
dictator forced out of power, and frankly, in a as these things go, in as peaceful a way as you can get a dictator out of power.
Why do they love him so much when they keep calling Trump a dictator, which is not a good thing in their estimation? They seem to love. There's all these puff pieces on socialism now, and the kind of the rewriting of the Cold War and the real heroes Gorbachev and all this stuff. I mean,
they love that. I mean, I remember talking to somebody who's explaining to me that no, the Cold War wasn't won by Reagan and by his incredible, in many ways, personal courage, but by Gorbachev. And I thought, that's like saying that there's no reason to fight World War II because Hitler was just going to commit suicide in a bunker anyway. Look, things happen for a reason. They happen because we put pressure on them. And I think the left likes these deathly experiments because everything else for them is so compromised. I'm going to say this about Chavez. He was not a compromised figure. He was exactly what he said he was. He was a socialist dictator, and he brooked no dissent. And there is something about those students screaming in university quads and the entire woke community on social media and even the squad. There's that kind of jackbooted, why do we have to listen to disagreeing opinions kind of attitude that they naturally love it. Even Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, is famous for saying, talking about China, we could be China for a day, because he thought, when one day, all we need is 24 hours to pass a lot of laws and a lot of regulations, do a lot of stuff, and then we can go back to being a chaotic democracy that he hates. There's no such thing as China for a day or Venezuela for a day. Once you give somebody absolute power like they did to Chavez, the third act is already written. It's either written in chaos, or it's written in a coup, or it's written in bloodshed or civil war. There's no way out once you go for the strongman. And it just seems to saying to me that we have to keep learning that lesson. And the irony is, of course, we're not learning that lesson. It's the poor people in Bolivia, the poor people in Venezuela, the poor Cubans. They have to live this way because the political science department at Harvard University finds them cute.
That's pretty much the case. I mean, don't forget that as much as a lot of us didn't care for Trump's "go back to where you came from" tweet for the squad, there was actually an impeachment vote in the House of Representatives based on that tweet.
Yeah, right.
So mean things definitely don't get well received on the left. There should be no criticism
whatsoever. He is impeached, right? Whether we agree with impeachment or not, whether we agree with all the phases of the impeachment process, including removal from office, even if we don't agree with that, if he's voted to be removed from office, he'll be escorted out of the White House, and no one will stop that. And there is something incredibly, fantastically American and patriotic about the idea that we know deep down in our hearts, if we wanted to get rid of this guy, we could get rid of him with a process that's been put in place for 250 years that people really do respect. So, and once again, America's awesome, and everywhere else needs to take a lesson.
That's exactly right. Although, speaking of social media, the number of people who spend just ridiculous amounts of time online almost daily fantasizing about multiple members of the Trump administration or multiple members of the Obama administration spending the rest of their lives in prison. Man, find yourself some better use of your time, because odds are none of that's going to happen.
Ain't going to happen, yeah. I mean, you don't go to prison because you disagree with you. That's listen, unfortunately, there are a whole bunch of people I like to put in prison for disagreeing with me. I'm not allowed to do it.
Let's go to our bad martini here now. You probably heard the news this morning that longtime New York Congressman Peter King is not going to run for re-election in 2020. 14-term congressman by the time all is said and done next year. Represents Long Island. It's an increasingly blue district. He says it's, of course, is to spend more time with his family. Doesn't enjoy the commute anymore suddenly after 3 decades every week because, D.C. to Long Island is the toughest commute for any member of Congress that we have here. But,
right.
the main reason is probably because things are getting bluer in the suburbs. It's not looking great for Republicans in 2020. And so Jim and I have mentioned before that while Peter King has done some good things in office, he's not necessarily our favorite. His fondness for the IRA, for example, back in the day, leaves kind of a stain. We've joked about how he's usually in tears when he watches Patriot games and things like that. But in the end here, this is, I think, less about Peter King and more about Republicans realizing that they're in huge trouble in the suburbs. If you look at last week's elections, Northern Virginia is a complete mess for Republicans. Suburban Philadelphia did not go well at all for Republicans, and there are other parts of the country as well. And if Republicans can't hang in the suburbs, they're going to have some real problems winning anything in terms of chambers of Congress or the White House.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we should, before we just jump into this, we should say that there is a chance that he is telling the truth and that he does actually is. That's a long time. He's been there 28 years. He just wants to do something else. That is possible. Okay, we're done. We're done considering that. All right, moving on then. Just want everybody pro forma. Let's say the guy could be, But the thing about these things never happen in a vacuum, and I don't think they even happen in a national assessment for Congress people, for representatives. That's essentially the high-level local job, right? You got to know everybody, and the guy, especially Peter King and his district. The local business people, who's talking to them. The local county prosecutor, county lawyer, all those people. He knows who he thinks is going to run against him, or he knows at least one of the two or the three people who are really thinking about it and have already had breakfast with various people. He knows what he's up against, so it's not quite exactly the national trend that he might be responding to, although that will help. I think partly it's what he knows that we don't, which is that there are people out there, and I think that the local grassroots Democratic recruitment efforts are actually really good. The top of the Democratic Party is filled with insane socialists, and they'll probably go down in flames at the top of the ticket in November 2020 if they insist on nominating a crackpot lefty. But if they can fill in the suburban districts and Long Island, which is look, Long Island's been pretty strongly was sort of pro-Trump for huge parts of it, but a lot of cops live there, that kind of thing. But a reasonable Democrat, an old line Northeast Democrat running, an ethnic Democrat, a Catholic Democrat, a church-going Democrat, that's hard to beat these days, right? I mean, the Republican brand is stained by Trump. There is no other way to look at it. Trump is a drag on the ticket, and the only hope for Republicans is that Democrats remain insane from the top of the ticket all the way down to dog catcher, and they're probably not going to do that. And I think Peter King knows it and thinks, oh, man, let me just go, I'll just go be on some bank boards, which is what you do when you're a former congressman. You're just on a lot of boards. Maybe somebody gives you a sweetheart loan somewhere and you open up your consultancy somewhere. So Peter King is probably making the wise choice, and it's probably a lot wiser than we even know.
So what's the counter to this? How do Republicans fight back against this, particularly with Trump on the ballot, or even once Trump's not at the top of the ticket?
Well, they're all just holding their breath. It's like, I feel like, you ever see those, I think they did this in Apocalypse Now, those Vietnam movies where the POWs are escaping, or they're maybe the special forces, and they sink down below the river and they're breathing through bamboo reeds. Or maybe those could be the guerrillas, whoever it is, right? That's what that's what the Republican Party is doing. That's what all the moderates and all the suburban Republicans are doing. They're just down below the water, breathing through the reeds, waiting for the Trump cloud to go. And the Democrats aren't going to let that happen. So the best bet for Republicans is to encourage robust disagreement, respectful disagreement with the president, which they don't seem to have the gumption to do, which is strange because that is one of the things that Reagan encouraged. And Bush certainly encouraged, called him up and said, "Say whatever you need to say, do whatever you need to do. We need you we need you in Congress." This president is not inclined to do that. And I think the party's going to suffer. Probably, it's going to be a 10, 15, it's going to be a political generation's worth of suffering, I think. There's no way out. I don't believe.
Kind of like the Democrats following Jimmy Carter a little bit.
Yeah. Or even Mondale, this idea that everything is there. Mondale ran as a 1947, union organizer. And that was in 1984. And people were like, good Lord, move on.
Can't believe that didn't work for him.
Yeah, it was not a successful, as I recall. We need Jim here. He knows all these facts and figures, but it was not a successful. He did win his home state. Barely.
Yeah.
He won it. Like, win is a win.
There's a great story about Reagan thinking that there were actually some shenanigans in Minnesota, but he figured that contesting the 50th state when he'd already won 49 might look a little bit like a sore winner, so he just kind of let it go. But
he was just happy he could go to bed early that night.
That's right. All right, on to our crazy martini now, Rob. And it was last week that Project Veritas released the footage of Good Morning America news anchor Amy Robach off camera, but on set and on mic, venting. This was back in August about how ABC News spiked her big story on Jeffrey Epstein 3 years earlier. She had an interview with at least one of his accusers. She said she had pictures and backup. She said we had everything. Even mentioned Clinton, some sort of Clinton tie into the story. So just venting over and over again how she's so mad that they had this years ahead of Epstein facing federal charges and ultimately his death in the cell. And depending on how much social media you consume, you know how many people aren't quite sure how that happened. So then ABC News got totally on it. Not to figure out who spiked the story and why, but because they wanted to make sure that the person who leaked the tape got punished. Right. So then they confirmed, or at least they thought they confirmed, that the person who leaked it had since moved over to CBS. And so they got in contact with CBS, and CBS promptly fired the producer, this woman named Ashley Bianco, who promptly told Megyn Kelly that she had nothing to do with this. She's the one who originally marked it the day that Amy Robach was having her little rant back in August, but she's not the one who leaked it. Here's a couple of different excerpts from the Megyn Kelly interview.
Did you leak the tape?
I did not.
Not to anyone?
No,
never. At any time?
No.
Did you make a clip of the moment?
I did, but I saved it in the internal system.
Was there any intention to embarrass her?
No, not at all.
Or ABC?
No, I would never. The 3 years I've spent at ABC, I've loved my time there. I'm a good employee. I've worked 7 days a week. I loved my job.
So was that the last you had to do with that clip?
Yeah, I didn't touch it. I didn't do anything else with that.
You never went back to it?
I never went back to it.
You didn't download it, you didn't email it, you didn't transfer that file in any way?
No, not at all. I didn't touch it after that. It stayed in the system. I hadn't even heard of Project Veritas until this.
Project Veritas, Rob, says that also ABC and CBS have the wrong person. There's so many different crazy elements here. First of all, the fact that they went on this rampage to find somebody responsible, and it seems quite likely now that they got the wrong person. And also that the mainstream media, whether it's ABC itself, CBS, a lot of folks on social media pointing at Brian Stelter and his Reliable Sources show over at CNN, not wanting to have anything to do with this story. Everybody pretending it didn't happen.
I know, and this poor young woman whose voice sounds so scared and terrified, and all she's trying to do, like in the old days under Stalin, is say, no, I'm a good party member. I would never ever do anything to hurt the party. And what I find so interesting about this is that we know now more about the chain of custody for that clip than we do about really Jeffrey Epstein's finances. Or that, for that matter, that the mainstream media has reported on the chain of custody of the Steele dossier. I mean, and they're trying to hide it. So the level of interest in this is just creating more and more, I think probably ultimately absurd conspiracy theories. But it's like, they always say it's the cover-up. It's indicative of a community of people who don't even need to talk to each other or pick up the phone or send each other a text or an email. They already know what each other wants. We want to stop this because it will embarrass us, because it probably was a little pressure from up top that this is kind of an embarrassing thing. Why do you have to look into this? It's not that important. There are no ramifications here. There's probably some level of, favor you do for people who you like. exactly the kind of thing that reporters and journalists usually expose. They tend to only report and expose those things that happen with their in the community of their political opponents. They tend to ignore and downplay and forget the things that happen among their political allies. And that's really what this reveals. I mean, the irony, of course, is that we're all going to be talking more about Jeffrey Epstein. Why, what happened in that cell? But the truth is what really happened is probably what they say happened. But what happened in ABC News and CBS News, with one organization scratching the back of the other, it's like Erich Honecker of East Germany helping out Brezhnev in Russia. I know what you want, Commissar. I'll help you out. What the irony is that within 24 hours, they'll be talking about, these unprecedented attacks on the press and the integrity of the press by the president. These dots will never connect for these people. If you just, all you have to do, really, literally, all you have to do is hire like a dozen conservatives to do something. To make coffee, just to be in the office. And every now and then you could turn to one of the conservatives and say, is this weird that we're doing this? And he or she will probably say, yeah, it's a little weird. You shouldn't do it. That's all you need.
But they can't do it.
Oh, God, no. What would happen if you had a conservative in the newsroom? Your news might be balanced.
Oh, there's plenty of conservatives who are on the panels now because they hate Trump. Only because they hate Trump. So.
Yeah, that's right. That's usually I've had that. I lived in Hollywood for a long time, and I've had people say to me when I've said moderate things, they're like, well, you're one of the good ones. I know you're a Republican, but I don't hate you. They'll say, like, without any irony at all. Really, people have said that to me. Like that when I remind them of the hall of the League of Supervillains they've created. From I don't know, Reagan to Bush to George W. to Romney to Bob Dole to all the people they now praise.
Right.
And I said, like you turned it up to 11 for George W. Bush. There's no 12. So now where are you going to go with Trump? He's 11 again, just like Romney and George W. Look, the Epstein thing is just one more weirdness, modern day weirdness where nothing can just be normal. Imagine how weird it seemed in 1972 to be hearing about the details of Watergate. How weird that must have been. And now we look at it and think, God, how boring. Just like they break in and whatever. This is not that interesting. Jeffrey Epstein is an international sex criminal who is a mysterious millionaire whose actual source of money is confusing and murky and completely underreported. And he dies in solitary confinement by suicide. You would think that some reporter would say, you know what, I don't care if it takes down some, Easter Island statues of the Democratic Party. I am going to go for this because this is going to make my bones. And instead, they're like, well, no. I promise you, I would never have revealed that. This is somebody who works for a news organization talking about how I would never have revealed the truth of what happened. I promise you, at no point did I think about this sort of incendiary and interesting tidbit ever revealing it at all to the public, because that would be rude.
We're not saying you believe it, Rob, but do you have a favorite Epstein didn't kill himself meme?
Well, I think Hillary Clinton did it. I wrote about it, and I did a National Review piece where I sort of cast Trump and Pence as Holmes and Watson, and Trump's is like looking through the crime scene, and he's figuring out that she did it. And my theory is that in the Holmes and Watson Trump Pence universe, Hillary Clinton is the famous femme fatale from the Sherlock Holmes novels. He'll always be chasing her. He'll never catch her. It's not just that he wants to put her behind bars. There's also a huge amount of romantic tension between the two of them. So it's gross. It's going to make don't read it after lunch, or read it after lunch.
Oh, man.
But it's online. You can find it.
You have no idea how many people you lost with that last phrase, but
That's right.
Rob, it is always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for filling in for Jim. We'll talk to you down the road.
Happy to be here.
Thanks to Rob Long filling in for Jim Garrity. Jim will be back on Tuesday. And again, happy Veterans Day to all who have worn the uniform of our country. We thank you so much for your sacrifices and your family sacrifices over the years. And we know that our freedoms have been preserved through your selfless service. And so this day is yours. Every day is yours. We salute you and your service to our country. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Tune in again Tuesday for the next Three Martini Lunch.